Well, that was a doozy, wasn't it? The only safe place for you to have been in the telling of that story was right at the feet of Jesus, among that crowd, watching a seer, a prophet at work. And we know what prophets do. They call out the hypocrisy of the hyper-religious with his parabolic imagination, intended to indict the guilty and inspire the oppressed. And boy, did Jesus bring it. But as the sparks fly, we do get singed, don't we? We can feel that tension, the distrust, the animosity born of a tightly held protectionism, all of that made for an uneasy truce. Perhaps not surprisingly, though, forgive me, I kind of feel for those religious professionals. I guess that's where I'm located in this text. They believed with all their heart that they were doing God's holy work. They were keeping the temple open and lucrative. They were busy saying the right things to Rome to stop them from shutting it all down. And they were busy providing the religious rituals that kept souls fed in the midst of a grinding, occupied existence. And then in comes Jesus, basically saying, "You brood of vipers, you whitewashed sepulchres, selling the dream of God for a nickel and a limp-legged dove or two." I'm caught in a place I would rather not be. Because if I kind of feel for those who are charged with the upkeep of religious practice, then Jesus has condemned not just them, but me as a wicked tenant killing the landowners sent to harvest. And I want to cry. That's not fair. I would never. Some of you know me. You know where I'm going now. I will retreat into some profound study of this text, a sociological one this week, and I remember that Matthew is writing what's called traumatized drama. He's trying to make sense not only of the tragedy of Jesus' trial and execution, but of his own generation's near destruction, not only by Rome, but by those fellow believers in Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Jacob, who rejected this notion that Jesus could possibly be God's Messiah. So, if I do that sort of study, then I can put the text right back on the page, musing, you know what? Matthew's only talking about the sectarian polarizations of a bygone era. But if I do that, I leave the ground of the story altogether and I walk away from something that Jesus is trying to teach me. As Amy Jill Levine has written and said, these parables are meant to sting and singe and unsettle and judge and provoke enough to make change in us possible. So if I try and settle this one down for me or for you, then I'm doing the text and Jesus and you a disservice. So turn it again, Jones, and what do I see? I see these. Grapes on the vine. This vineyard, where the time of harvest has come, and the grapes hang on the vine, heavy, ripe, sweet, tempting to birds and mice and mold and decay and ruin. All while the bickering and the murder and the mayhem go on among those who are charged with the care of that fruit and that harvest. As I think about that, I start to get anxious about that harvest. I'm a gardener after all, I'm used to that. And then I think, I wonder if that's what God feels when political and religious and familial bickering and posturing and obfuscating and petty or massive acts of mutual destruction because of lust for power and position occur in any generation, including our own, among those who have any responsibility to care for others. Because when that primary responsibility to care is forgotten, overridden, or disregarded, then what happens to the fruit, the harvest, the grapes? What happens to the kids, the sick, the spiritually starving? What happens to all of those whose livelihoods, lives, rely on the just apportioning of nations and world resources? What happens to all of those who depend upon wise and good governance? Is it any wonder then that this good God, who created out of love and delight this world of blessing and abundance, is going to look elsewhere, anywhere, for anyone who will say yes to God's question, who will tend to the harvest? Who will care for the climate? Who will protect the watersheds and the rainforests? Who will seek reconciliation and justice for the descendants of the oppressed, the survivors of oppression? Who will care for the sick and the elderly and the young? Who will bind the wounds, physical, spiritual, and mental? My brain works in funny ways, because at this moment when I hear who will, the children's story pops into my head mischievously. And I hear, "Not I," said the lazy dog. "Not I," said the sleepy cat. "Not I." I try and dismiss that as a distraction, but then I think, is it? How many times can churches, religious communities of every stripe, can governments, individuals, be rightly convicted of neglect to do the one thing that we have been called to do and be, to care? And we do this with all sorts of justifying excuses that in the end count for little if the grapes rot, if creation passes a climactic tipping point, if too many die of COVID or of war or of spoiled water. In this parable, as well as in the classic version of the little red hen, there's this moment of judgment and seeming condemnation that arrives. The hen bakes her bread and she eats it herself as the other barnyard animals watch hungrily, shamed and excluded by their excuses. In the parable, Jesus asks the question of his accusers, what will the fate be of the wicked tenants when the owner returns? And they answer, oh, they'll be condemned and shamed by the owner who moves on without them. But did you notice when I told the story that when Jesus speaks again after they have done this condemnation, he doesn't actually endorse their answer. Instead, he talks about building a new structure on that which was condemned, the rejected stone. Something that he then quotes the psalmist is scandalous, shocking in our eyes. Now, most interpretations see this as a reference to Jesus himself as the one crucified, looks nothing like the Messiah that people wanted or expected, and yet who becomes the foundation for what we are today, the church. But I wonder too if this is Jesus, the midrash the Darshan, the one who turns these ancient texts, and who, again, to quote the scholar of the New Testament who is Jewish, her name Amy Jill Levine, she says that Jesus was always telling stories of judgment to catch us up in our own judgmentalism. Where we look for shame and guilt, Jesus spins these yarns to challenge, humble, and then inspire us to rewrite our endings away from judgmentalism to possible futures shaped by the dream of God. Now, in Philemon Sturgis' beautifully whimsical retelling of the Little Red Hen, after she has baked not just bread but an entire pizza, she invites the animals who did not help, the duck, the dog, and the cat, to come and eat with her. And after having eaten this feast, she then asks them, "Who will help me with the dishes?" And we are invited to guess the answer. Now, good folk watching this morning, what would you like the answer to be? Would you like it to be that when we are invited to a feast that God has prepared without our help, that we would be so changed by this grace, that when we're asked by God, "Now then, who will help me with the harvest? Who will help me with the work of the kingdom and the dream of finding and salving, of healing and mending?" that this will be our answer. Do you see them? Having a whale of a time helping the hen as they say, "We will. We will help with the harvest." Amen.